Before we dive into user authentication, let's get familiar with the project we're working with. With the Gradle tool window open, I'm going to run my boot run task to fire up my application. We'll wait for all of our code to compile. Looks good. And the Spring app, as you see, Spring is the library we're using here, has now successfully started. So let's switch to Chrome and navigate to the home page. Localhost. There it is, right there. Now this project is called To-Do Today and is a simple task management application. Currently, tasks are global so that anyone who visits our app sees the same tasks, and anyone can create a new task or mark existing tasks as complete or unmark them as complete. The application will show the same tasks and status to everyone. And notice that when I first pulled up the app, there was no login page. We want to change that. Our goal in this workshop is to have user-specific tasks and require each user to fully log in or authenticate before proceeding. Let's switch back to IntelliJ and check out our starting point for code. I'm going to collapse my run panel here. So this application is coded using a software stack that you should be familiar with. I have an H2 database with Hibernate as the ORM. Let's take a peek at the data config class. So in our main package here, com.teamtreehouse.todotoday, we've got a bunch of other sub-packages here. In the config package, you'll find the data config class. You'll notice here that I've used this properties file for all Hibernate properties, and I've loaded those properties into an auto-wired Spring environment variable, and I accomplished that handy task using Spring's property source annotation. A handy shortcut for sure. Now you could just as easily have put Hibernate properties into a hibernate.cfg.xml file, as we've done in previous Hibernate courses in our library. There's one annotation here that I definitely want to point out, which explains why I'm configuring a local container entity manager factory bean instead of a local session factory bean, as you've seen on Treehouse previously. The reason for this change is because in this app, I'm using what are called Spring Data JPA repositories, which explains the annotation that I wanted to point out. Enable JPA repositories on the class there. Now, our application uses the service DAO pattern, and you can see that because I have these DAO and service packages in the project. But what we can do is have Spring Data generate our DAO implementations by using smart method naming. I'll open the task DAO to show you what I mean. You'll notice that I've applied a repository annotation to the interface, which isn't what we've done in previous courses. Previously, we annotated the implementation and not the interface. But you'll also notice here that I'm extending the CRUD repository interface, which comes from the Spring Data library. When you do these things and you've enabled JPA repositories like I did in the data config class, Spring Data will generate the implementing classes for you. And all you have to do is write interface methods that you'd like to be implemented that aren't included in the CRUD repository interface. And Spring Data does the rest for you. That is, Spring Data, upon application boot, will generate a class that implements this task DAO interface. Now, I mentioned something about smart method naming. Now, Spring Data would know by the method named, say, find by description, that its implementation that it generates needs to return a single task object that matches the description passed. In Spring Data, these are called query methods. Check the teacher's notes for more information on what your options are with query methods. Now, the last thing I want to point out is that I've included a file named import.sql. You'll find that in the resources directory. So let me open that. This file will be the source of our initial data that we're loading into the database. Currently, I've configured Hibernate's HBM to DDL tool to destroy and recreate our application on boot. And you can see that by opening the application.properties file. Here, the HBM to DDL tool is set to create drop. Cool, let me go back to import.sql. Now this import.sql file will ensure that initial data will be loaded into the database when we boot our application. Okay, so that wraps up our first look at To-Do Today. And just so our fingers don't get too itchy for coding, let's go ahead and add Spring Security as a dependency in the Gradle build file. So let me open build.gradle. And this dependency will be a compile time dependency. So let me add it to this group here, even though order doesn't really matter. org.spring-framework.boot spring boot starter security. Now I'll use the Gradle tool window to refresh any dependencies so that everything is downloaded and added to the class path. Next, we'll start coding the entities we'll need to implement authentication.